They are one of the most iconic psychedelic rock bands to come out of the 1960s, and they would end up playing the Monterey Pop Festival, Woodstock, and Altamont. And of course, I'm talking about Jefferson Airplane.
Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love? Wouldn't you love somebody to love? You better find somebody to love.
Jefferson Airplane is probably one of the more complex bands for me to try to talk about in a very limited time frame, because you don't just talk about Jefferson Airplane. It's actually a family of bands, which would include Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, and Hot Tuna, and all the various musicians that would flow in and out of all those bands depending on the specific year or iteration that you kind of want to dive into. And in trying to map out the musicians and which ones were associated with which of these bands, what you see is that Grace Slick is actually probably the most common denominator, with her being affiliated with Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, and Starship. But here's the thing. Grace was not the original female vocalist. That honor actually went to founding member Signe Tolley, or Signe Tolley Anderson. Now, Signe would spend about a year or so with the band. In fact, she would participate in their debut album, Jefferson Airplane Takes Off. And an important thing to point out here is that she had a fundamental distrust of the band's manager at that time, Matthew Katz, and she refused to sign any contract with him unless he put a special clause into the agreement, essentially giving her the freedom to release herself from any of his controls in the event that she left the band for any reason. And this would serve her well because she would end up leaving the band after the birth of her child, but her distrust of Matthew actually serves as kind of foreshadowing for a point that I'll share later in this post. Now, Grace Slick was not the first choice for the band in looking for a replacement for Signe. That actually went to a singer by the name of Sherry Snow, who was part of a folk rock duo called Blackburn and Snow.
I am a stranger in a strange land, traveling through here to find what love I can.
At the time, Marty Balin of Jefferson Airplane was also the founder of a club called The Matrix, where a band that Grace Slick, her husband, and her brother-in-law had created called The Great Society would play there frequently. So this gave her the opportunity to develop a relationship with the members of Jefferson Airplane. So when they invited Grace to come on board, not only would she leave her band, The Great Society, she would also leave her husband and even bring some of the music that she had written for The Great Society into Jefferson Airplane.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small. And the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall. And here you go, chasing rabbits, and you know you're going to fall. Tell 'em a hookah, smoking caterpillar has given you a call.
With the core lineup in place, Jefferson Airplane would now officially take off on what drummer Spencer Dryden would later refer to as the acid merry-go-round. And over the next 3 years, they would end up releasing 4 albums, including Surrealistic Pillow, After Bathing at Baxter's, Crown of Creation, and 1969's Volunteers, which, if you reflect back to when I was talking about Signe's gut intuition saying that she couldn't trust the manager, Matthew Katz, well, it would be during 1969's Volunteers that guitarist Paul Kantner would actually co-write a song with David Crosby and Stephen Stills. And at that time, he was having an issue with Matthew Katz, where Katz was pretty much freezing anything that Kantner's name was associating with, to the point where Paul had to call up Stephen Stills and say, hey, look, man, you probably shouldn't credit the song to me, because if you do, there's a possibility that Katz is going to freeze it. So initially, the song did not get any credit given towards Paul Kantner, and it would end up being released 2 times that year, once by Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and once again by Jefferson Airplane.
Wooden ships on the water, very free. Easy, you know the way it's supposed to be. Silver on the shoreline, let us be. Talking about very free and easy.
1970 to 1974, Jefferson Airplane would enter what I consider to be a period of destabilization. The band would release 2 2 more albums, Bark and Long John Silver, which would enable them to fulfill their end of their record contract. But this is where we'll also see individual members start focusing on personal projects. Guitarist Jorma Kaukonen and bassist Jack Cassidy would launch Hot Tuna, a more blues-centric band where the musicians would be very fluid. At times over the years, playing host to musicians from Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, and Starship. This is also the time period where we'd see Paul Kantner and Grace Slick focusing on personal projects, which would eventually lead to them pulling musicians from Jefferson Airplane with musicians from their personal projects into a new iteration called Jefferson Starship. In 1978, Grace Slick would be asked to leave the band following a drunken rant that she went on at one of their concerts in Germany. Later on that year, Marty Balin would leave the group, essentially leaving Jefferson Starship without a vocalist. As a result, they would reach out to Mickey Thomas, who had been a backup singer for Elvin Bishop and even sang lead vocals on Bishop's Fooled Around and Fell in Love.
I didn't care how much they cried, no sir. The tears left me cold as a stone. But then I fooled around and fell in love.
Can't you see it's all over for you and me, girl? There's a time for love and a time for letting it be, baby. Ain't afraid to feel cold. It's time to go. I hear that voice again, saying, find your way back. Find your way back to her heart. Find your way back. Find your way back to her heart.
In 1984, Paul Kantner would decide to leave the band, and in doing so, he would block the remaining members from using the band name Jefferson Starship. As a result, the follow-on album, Knee Deep in the Hoopla, would be listed as just simply Starship. In 1988, Grace Slick would end up leaving Jefferson Starship in order to reunite with the core members of Jefferson Airplane, with exception of Spencer Dryden, for what would end up being their final album together as Jefferson Airplane.
What about right now? Please, someone tell me, what do I do while I'm waiting to be so hide their pain. They say everything's fine. No one will hear them complain. But behind those smiles, so much purple rain.
The individual members of Jefferson Airplane would end up collaborating within a larger community of musicians, which would include people like Carlos Santana, Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Grateful Dead, where combined their collaborative output would end up influencing an immeasurable number of future musicians and end up providing the soundtrack for an entire generation, which is why it really is a difficult band to talk about, because there's so many facets to the story of Jefferson Airplane, Jefferson Starship, Hot Tuna, etc. Which is why I look forward to keeping this conversation going within the comments as you share your thoughts with me on Jefferson Airplane or any of the other projects that they were involved with.